welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and with me today is nobody. We haven't heard from Xandring yet, so we'll see how he's doing. Hopefully, he'll be by in a little bit. Thank you all.
What do you mean you haven't heard from me?
Oh, dear Lord! Oh, he is here. How? When did? Okay. I didn't. It doesn't notify me when you come in the room. I didn't even. Okay. Welcome. You're here. All right.
Yeah, I've been here for a little bit.
Oh, okay. You've been listening in. You've been listening in.
I have.
I totally meant everything I said. All right. So, all right. Well, good. Glad. Sorry, I did not see you come into the room. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Actually, we're going to start at, I think, 9:45 a.m. We're going to start the coverage of the third day of hearings. I'm looking forward to the fourth. I think the fourth is going to be pretty spectacular from what they've been saying. But, excuse me, we'll be covering that on this channel. But tonight, oh, dear Lord, if I can ever stop coughing. Tonight, we're going to be discussing specifically science conspiracy theories. We have Dr. X back, and you may recall we've had him on to discuss conspiracy theories in general, but as our resident expert in conspiracy theories, he's going to come on to talk about scientific conspiracy theories with us. Also with us today is Homozygoat, who we've had on a good number of times. So why don't I actually bring both of them out now? And gentlemen, how are you?
Good.
Doing pretty well. Thank you for having me back.
Oh, our pleasure. Okay, we'll try to keep you away. It's like we want to do shows on medical stuff because it turns out to be relevant. We're like, we got to have on somebody who knows what they're talking about, and it ain't us. So thank you very much for coming. So, listen, my wife has a PhD in biochemistry. So, and she runs the Facebook group I Fucking Love Vaccines. And so this family does, in fact, have a position on that. But she has been accused of working for George Soros and Bill Gates and all these other things. I think if it were true, she should be getting paid more. But all that notwithstanding, we see a lot of this stuff. And for me, there's a bit of a difference. We've discussed conspiracy theories before, but when it comes to science, I'm not sure, and I'd like Dr. X to fill us in a little bit about this. But when it comes to science, it feels like there is a bit of a difference. Now, we've got conspiracy theories about aliens and about elections and all this other stuff. But when it comes to science, it may be that they're born out of the same fears or misunderstandings, but it seems to me that because science is this endeavor that is really an attempt to improve the human condition, first of all, it seems to me at least almost overly offensive when it's science. Again, the fact that my wife is a PhD in biochemistry may make me slightly biased on that one, but also it still seems like we do have more of a tendency to go after scientific theories, and I'm not sure if that's because they're a little more out of reach to people, so it makes it more vulnerable to that kind of thing. I don't know, but that's why you guys are here. So actually, before we begin, just Homozygoat, if you could quickly introduce yourself and your background. Dr. X, introduce yourself and your background, and then we'll see if we can answer some of those questions.
Sure. Hi, my name is Marcus. My internet name is Homozygoat. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in cellular and molecular biology at the University of Vermont. I have a pretty extensive background in infectious diseases. My bachelor's and master's were in microbiology. My research background is in cancer biology and neuroscience. So I tend to function kind of as a biology generalist, so to speak, these days. But obviously, we're living through a renaissance of infectious disease, so I get to dig out all of the training from the cobweb-filled corners of my brain.
Well, and those of you who are already on our Discord, if you're not, please join our Discord. If you are, you know that we're usually ahead of even mainstream media when it comes to the news. But when it comes to scientific news, that man's Discord is ahead of us. We get our news from his Discord when it comes to COVID, monkeypox, and other infectious diseases. We'll be dropping a link to that in a minute. And Dr. X, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, so I'm Dr. 𝗢𝗚𝗏. I'm an associate professor at Beijing Normal University in Zhuhai. I wrote a PhD called In Defense of Conspiracy Theories, which was formally accepted back in 2012. I'm the author of The Philosophy of Conspiracy Theories, the first solo authored book looking at a social epistemological analysis of why we should or shouldn't believe particular conspiracy theories. And I'm just an active researcher in the field of conspiracy theories generally. And like most people, I've become kind of re-energized by this discord in the era of the novel coronavirus, because as you wisely point out, when we start talking about scientific conspiracy theories, particularly medical conspiracy theories, belief in these theories has consequences in the way that, say, believing that Elvis faked his death doesn't really seem to.
Excellent segue. And I will say, before we follow that, that was the interesting one that I was a little surprised about from last time you came on, which is actually you really are not, you're not against conspiracy theories per se. Is that right?
Yeah, because, well, I mean, we know conspiracies occur. I mean, anyone who is politically or historically literate knows that conspiracies do occur. And anyone who is politically or historically literate will also be aware that certain people have tried to cover up their conspiratorial activity by calling descriptions of those conspiracies conspiracy theories. So we do need to be cautious in our dismissal of these things called conspiracy theories in order to ensure that we don't kind of throw out the actual conspiracies at the same time we're dismissing the conspiracy theories. So yes, I'm largely sympathetic to the process of conspiracy theorizing, but that doesn't mean I think that we should have a carte blanche belief in conspiracy theories. I simply think we need to investigate them to work out when they go wrong, why they go wrong, and why, on occasion, actually we should believe them.
All right. So having said that, yeah, I do think it does seem to me that scientific theories, conspiracy theories, are sort of a class of their own, at least on a few fronts. So, Homozygoat, what are some of the medical conspiracy theories that you hear most?
Yeah, so I think a lot of them pertain to COVID vaccines. That seems to be the conspiracy theory du jour of probably the past 2 years, is either things the vaccine is going to do to you, is currently doing to you, or has done to everybody except for you and could do to you at any possible given moment. So I've heard a whole laundry list of things from, it made my genitalia fall off, to 5G microchips, to government mind control chemicals, but instead of being dropped from a plane, it's actually through an injection. Everything you could possibly think of has been attributed to vaccines. And I think there's, if you wanted to really speak to it in the most, I guess technically accurate grounds and, denote logical fallacies, which is, a very boring discussion. You can just say they're attributing anything possible to a recent event of COVID vaccination, that they're not necessarily linked. But kind of like Dr. X said, there's usually something deeper going on when you hear a lot of things like that. And as it pertains to COVID vaccines, I think you could substitute anything for COVID vaccines, whether it's other vaccines or, scientists holding the cure for cancer back or anything like that. It seems to be that there's, I think, a void of actual proper communication that is being filled with conspiracy theorizing. Regardless of what flavor or appearance or shape that it takes on. I think those are just simply, convenient sources of information to sort of expound upon when it comes to generating a conspiracy theory de novo.
I was very disappointed that when I got my vaccine, my COVID vaccine, that I didn't grow fur, tail, large teeth, and howl at the full moon. I was very disappointed. I was very much invested in that theory.
I wouldn't have minded that. I was disappointed that my 5G didn't go up. I mean, I thought I was supposed to get better signal or something like that. But okay. So,
and Alex Jones promised me that I would turn into a jellyfish, and I still appear to be quite solid.
My condolences, I guess. Well, so Is science more prone to these kinds of theories, and why or why not?
I mean, I would guess to a certain extent, scientific conspiracy theories end up being kind of prominent in the discourse because science, by and large, is very hard for ordinary people to understand. So the kind of era of, and I'm going to use in scare quotes, the gentleman scientist that we talk about during the Enlightenment, the person who can have a little lab in their basement, engage in experimentation, discover new things, share those things with other people in their community in a really easy to understand way. Probably never really occurred. So scientific process and practice is a social practice. It's kind of embedded in society. But the idea that individuals can do science on their own and understand everything in the scientific corpus just isn't possible now. And so when we start talking about things such as viral load vaccines or mRNA vaccines, we're talking about processes which are very difficult even for experts to understand, let alone to explain to the public. And in a situation where you've got explanations which might as well seem like magic to the ordinary public, it's very easy for people to go, well, there's obviously something up with that. There's something weird about that. And if I can't understand it, and this is kind of the appeal to, well, I'm a clever person. If I can't understand what's going on here, then surely someone's trying to mislead me. So I think part of the problem is when we start dealing with complicated situations, there is a tendency by some people to go, well, it can't be that complicated. Ipso facto, there must be something else going on, and they're just trying to bamboozle us.
I've seen firsthand. I personally think that it's media malfeasance, and it's definitely biased. I even hesitate to call it research, but I've seen studies published to journals. Granted, these are generally second-rate journals, not top-tier journals, but then those are forwarded on to journalists, and then in your Sunday tabloids you have all these things. Research shows or new study shows, and it seems like every other one is contradicting each other. And I've seen now 3 that were, the study was done by incredibly biased people, and the sample size was 2. I mean, it's a completely junk study done specifically so that media can say a study shows this, and it's obviously in favor of some larger corporation that's putting out, usually in the dietary field. The 3 that I saw were in the dietary field. Do you think that's that might have a big contributing factor as to why people are going, I'm not so sure that scientists really know what they're talking about? Every other time it's like, eggs are good for me this week, they're bad for me next week. What the hell's going on here?
I mean, there is a kind of resurgent issue in media reporting of scientific issues. It turns out most newspapers don't employ scientists to be science reporters these days. So what you have are people who are doing other journalistic jobs who are then asked to report on scientific information, and often the turnaround on those stories is really, really fast. So you get inaccurate reporting based upon skim reading of articles. But I think Homozygoat actually has a point he wants to make on this, and I interrupted him by speaking too quickly.
No. I mean, I was going to say something I think pretty similar in that the media doesn't actually have a grounded understanding of the scientific facts when they go to report on things. But I think, Sandor, you also touched on a point in that some people who are acting in a malicious manner can sort of almost manufacture their own consent through the media by creating very spurious preprints, which are pre-peer-reviewed publications, hosting them on servers where these things normally sit until they are peer-reviewed. But media will not necessarily understand that it hasn't met the scientific peer review process yet, and they'll report on it as if it's it's fact, it's already done. And what they'll report on is quite often just deranged, out of one's mind theorizing that's just masquerading as data. Where I think the last one I read, which is actually peddled by a Nobel Prize winning virologist who recently passed away. So this is a posthumous conspiracy theory from a Nobel Prize winner, was that COVID vaccines give you a crippling prion disease and that everyone's going to drop dead any moment now. Which, again, like, you read that at face value and you either don't understand it because it's filled with jargon, or you just take it at face value because you're trusting the source from which it came from, if you are reading it from the perspective of media. So that's why I think it really it underscores Dr. X's point very strongly, that there needs to be that scientific competence within media in order to properly tackle issues like this, because if not, your mind as a journalist is essentially an open hole through which anybody can put anything in there, and then stuff gets out, and now you've got half the population scared that the vaccine is going to give them brain damage and turn their frontal lobe into Swiss cheese. So
how do we fix that, though?
I do want to know how we fix that. I do want to ask. So there was a, or I want to point out that there was a study done on alcohol in the human heart. And they found that alcohol causes the human heart to relax, which is ostensibly good for the heart. People were saying, okay, scientists have determined that alcohol is good for the heart. Well, no, it had one positive impact, but nobody was saying it was good for you. They were saying that it helped relax the heart, which can be a good thing. But it turned out, of course, that the net effect was negative. So I assume that fits in with what both of you were talking about, the competency of a journalist who didn't realize that saying it had a beneficial effect is not the same thing as saying it's good for the heart. So, and then dovetailing that into his Andring's point, how do we combat that?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, like that certainly is a problem. I think what Andring was really getting at was sort of the notion of a scientific consensus and whether or not it's really formed around a given issue. Sometimes, like if we're alluding to alcohol as an example, or a very common dietary science, such as should I eat eggs? Is it filled with too much fat, not enough fat? There seems to be varying degrees of understanding as it pertains to advancements in diet and metabolism study. So, when the reporting on that really doesn't necessarily reflect that, a lot of this is either very context dependent, it comes with a lot of caveats, and isn't simply like broadly applicable to any one given person at any given time, and that maybe in a particular field there isn't even a consensus formed yet. When none of those things are being communicated to people at large, then they're going to develop that like very gradual mistrust of this institution, where it's like, well, they can't even tell me whether eggs are good or bad for me. How can they tell me that the vaccine's safe? How can they tell me that all of the vaccines I got as a kid are also safe? How can they tell me that there's no mind control chemicals being dropped from the plane? You can have that distrust of the institution really abused and send people down all sorts of different rabbit holes, for sure.
So
is there
to his Andring's point,
that
how do we fight it? Oh, sorry. Yep.
Oh yeah, that's what I was going to read. So how do we fix it so that, or improve the situation so that we're not getting all of these conflicting stories? Is it something that journalists need to step up and do? Is it something the population needs to step up and do? Or is this just something that's probably not going to happen because it's like trying to put a whole bunch of cats in a pen?
Yeah, I suppose it's... Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So what we should say is I don't think journalists are doing this maliciously. I think the problem is allocation of resources here. Journalists are they suffer time crunches like the rest of us. Most people who are doing scientific reporting in newspapers are doing other jobs at the same time. What we need is better.
I think Elon Musk figured out he's...
Yeah, CIA got him.
Yes.
No, he just wants to leave us.
Oh, there we are.
No, probably not. Solve this problem.
All right, take your time. We'll make sure that we get back to that as soon as we.
We can solve this problem.
Okay, that sounds like aliens to me.
Yeah, I think it's internet issues.
Well, obviously, he didn't get his booster vaccine. I
appear to be back.
Oh, there you go. All right, so you were saying.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I don't think journalists are doing this maliciously. I think this is a situation of the kind of funding mechanisms we have. Most journalists who are doing science reporting are doing other jobs on the side. What we need is better funding. Part of the issue is that we're seeing the collapse of the traditional funding mechanisms of the media in the West via advertising. We probably do need to think about finding better ways to give journalists the time and money to do their jobs, money in respect to allow there to be actual specific science reporters, and time, which is to say, look, rather than telling a science reporter, I need the story by tomorrow, say, I need the story later this week or sometime this month. Because part of the issue often is editors want stories now, and the scientific journalists I've talked to have gone, well, I mean, it takes me a day to read the paper, and then a day or two to check the references, and then a day or two to talk to other scientists to go, is this actually a report which is kind of congruent with other work coming out here? And then and only then am I in a position to go, all right, what this paper says is, it reflects the consensus, and the editor's going, yeah, we needed that story 2 days ago. Can you get it to us now? So we need to also get rid of the time crunch around this kind of reporting.
Yeah, and then to boot, I think in the vein of resource allocation, large media entities just, I think, are very reluctant to hire scientists, not only for that time crunch reason, but also just out of the notion that sensationalism is going to sell and have better online metrics in terms of clicks and ad serving online compared to reporting things in a very scientifically accurate way. So I think, and what I advocate for still, is having actual staff scientists as part of media entities to do this almost kind of consulting work where journalists who are working on a story run something by a scientist, or even a handful of them, maybe to expedite that process of sort of doing the quote unquote research, doing the legwork, and seeing if particular takes or opinions are aligned with consensus. But unfortunately, I think due to our nature of economic organization, we're really disincentivized from having any of that happen in the first place. And it's a shame, because within the institution of science, and we're graduating more PhDs than ever, there's an absolute job crisis within academia. Fewer and fewer PhD graduates are going to go get a postdoc and get a tenure track or non-tenure track position at a university. There's a surplus of PhDs who can't find jobs, and that would be one, I think, really nice avenue to siphon some of them who are very skilled, and by virtue of getting a PhD, they have displayed their ability to engage with the scientific literature and synthesize new information. So I think they have the skill set to do it. It's just, unfortunately, news media doesn't want to do that for a couple of reasons that I mentioned, and I guess we're living through the detriment of not having that be a feature of large media entities.
What I'm hearing is it's essentially a lack of, it's a screwed up incentive structure, and the only way that I can see changing an incentive structure is to get enough of the population to care enough about it in order to create an incentive for it to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that care is already there. I mean, COVID, I think, is proof. At no point ever has anybody given a shit about a PCR test until COVID happened. Outside of science, you say the acronym PCR to anybody, and they'd be like, "I'm sorry, what, are you having a stroke? Why are you saying this?" But nowadays, it's oh yeah, I know that thing. I might have to go get one of those tests before I get on this plane to go visit my family or something. So the care is there when the science has very real material impact on people's lives and in their immediate living conditions. It's just unfortunate that we can't harness that, or almost weaponize that to compel large corporate entities to do what is necessary, simply because their incentive structure fundamentally disregards the will of the people. Now their incentives are simply bottom line, and unless you had a mass bout of direct action where everybody decided to boycott CNN or Fox News's websites and not drive revenue through there, which I'm not sure would even do anything anyways, because their coffers are already so deep. It seems very difficult to compel them to care regardless. I think that's the point that I'm trying to get at.
So if somebody, so I think there's the problem of inaccurate reporting, the problem of maybe disingenuous studies that as Andring had mentioned earlier. there's also a problem of where the information has actually either been correct in the past, such as the Tuskegee experiments, or where somebody like Wakefield does his study, and it came out, and it was just debunked later and proven that he faked his results. So what do we do? And I think those are two very different cases. So I think it's two separate questions. What do we do in the case? Let's start with what do we do in the case of somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, there's a study that shows that the vaccines do in fact cause autism." Now, the information that study is debunked has been out there for a while. So how do we deal with that?
I mean, part of the problem with the Wakefield stuff is where that study was published. It was published in The Lancet in the UK, the most prestigious medical journal that Britain has. And that had a certain amount of weight. Getting published in a venue like that means that people take your views seriously. And the problem with scientific retractions is they take a really long time. So the process the Lancet went through to investigate the complaints about the paper took, I think, about 12 years from woe to go. And in part that was because Wakefield wasn't willing to retract his findings, even if the co-authors on the paper were going, actually, we were misled by Andrew on these particular issues. Of retraction in the sciences is a lengthy process because you've got to make sure that if you are retracting a paper, you're retracting it for the right reasons rather than because there's a bit of outrage, which meant that paper continued to be cited and talked about by people in the anti-vax community during the investigation. And of course, by the time the investigation ended, there were numerous conspiracy theories about the motivation behind the retraction. So it had embedded itself in society by that point. And so part of the issue here is the question is, why did this paper get through peer review in the first place? Is there a problem with the system by which these publications work? And a variety of different institutions in the sciences are trying to fix that. So you have PLOS ONE, which is the scientific journal where people put their results online as essentially a free preprint, which allows for instantaneous feedback. If you had things like that operating in the medical sciences, you might find people going, yeah, this data set about the autism link here seems a little bit suspicious. Some of these children seem to be the same child repeated several times here, or the symptomology that's been described here doesn't seem to be generalizable across all these particular cases. So one solution would be, you have an open access peer review in constant process kind of thing. But the problem is, as soon as you hit publish, whether it be in PLOS ONE or The Lancet, there's a kind of institutional authority that comes with being published at that point. And that's the really hard problem here. How do we have discussions about these things? Because I'm not saying that the link between vaccines and autism is a serious topic we need to investigate, but there are going to be situations where there are radical scientific hypotheses which people do want to do research on, and they're going to want to put preliminary findings out. How do we set up a system which allows legitimate inquiry of that type to go ahead versus the kind of fraudulent activity that Wakefield was engaged in? And as a philosopher, I can say it's a problem. I'm not sure how we solve it, though.
Yeah, you want to have a better understanding of what the problem is without solutions. Ask a philosopher.
Yeah, precisely.
Well, I mean, I could probably take that a step farther. I mean, I entirely agree with everything that Mr. X just said. I think part of, what kind of results in situations like the Wakefield, publication in the Lancet, happening is the fact that, again, I think there's more fundamental flaws with the system than the institution is really willing to acknowledge at this point. Not out of malfeasance, but I think simply out of, a desire to not have, egg very publicly on their face, especially at a time like now where we need people to continue trusting the institution as, situations like the pandemic or the monkeypox outbreaks continue to evolve, perhaps quite literally. But if you want to talk about peer review, peer reviewers themselves really are not incentivized all that well to do a great job. I don't think they're paid as much as they should be, if at all, for the act of being a peer reviewer. So this is simply expected out of the benevolence of a scientist heart to give back to the institution rather than financially incentivized for people to actually sit down and do a proper job of reviewing something, so that way they can catch faulty methodology or made up patients and data tables and stuff like that. But on top of that, the entire notion of peer review recently, I'd say probably in the last decade, has truly been weaponized, I think, for profiteering purposes, not by scientists, but rather the publishers themselves. If you want to talk about a company like 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿, which is a for-profit journal that charges scientists an arm and a leg to publish their research in any journal that they own, you essentially gamify the publication process of any research one way or another into a game where the publishers want to make as much money as possible. So they'll publish any hot piece of garbage that's thrown their way, so long as the people throwing it their way give them a nice fat check. And then the scientists themselves who are trying to publish the work, their worth as a scientist is often determined by things like citation metrics and impact factors and the like. So they also have an incentive to publish as much as possible. That's why it's called publish or perish, right? If your scientific career as a researcher is to flourish, your output is essentially your measure of productivity as a scientist within the institution. So you want to publish as much stuff as possible so you can leverage it for grant proposals and the like. So there's an incentive for, on the research end for some scientists to either overtly fraudulently do things wrong in order to just get publications through, or to be very shoddy and carefree and overlook a lot of mistakes. I think in the Wakefield case, it was definitely the former. But there was a much greater, I think, politically expedient point that Wakefield was trying to make / engage in with the vaccines cause autism conspiracy. He was really trying to spearhead that, but he took advantage of those flaws within the system, the ease of publication, the great respect for credentials, and the desire for anybody really to output their work to prove that they are a functioning member of science and medicine. All of these things, I think, came together in a really ugly way as it pertained to Wakefield. But I think a lot of the flaws that allowed that to happen still exist.
Well, and especially if you're in industry, I assume that the more publications you have, the greater you can demand as a salary.
Well, I mean, to an extent, I think, with industry, it's probably going to be very context dependent. If you're talking about, insert company here, if you're applying there as a career scientist, you want to go work for Pfizer or Moderna, just as an example. I think a lot of the time they're going to be more incentivized just, and towards having another highly educated, warm body in the room to do the very technically complicated work that needs to be done. But as it pertains to the other aspects of industry, they do publish. I mean, they will have basically a lot of industry scientists on author bylines when they're publishing new vaccine efficacy data as it pertains to a certain group of the population. But generally, industry is either from their own profits or from private philanthropy. So they're, I think, less incentivized to take advantage of the "we'll publish anything" type of structure that exists, because their money is coming from other sources. They don't necessarily abide by the publish or perish mentality as much as a true academic would.
And I'm going to hit the super chat real quick. $5 super chat from the Sinister Porpoise. I told the host that he must install Linux and install drivers through a tarball to get the benefits of 5G internet from his vaccine. I listened. Porpoise, thank you very much for your super chat and for your support. I've talked to our producer about that, and our producer just... probably a little incompetent, to be quite honest. And I don't know what he knows about Linux, but I mean, I'm with you. I am totally with you on that. Porpoise, who routinely says, she routinely tells people she can solve everybody's problems with Windows by installing Linux. Thank you very much for the super chat. I'll pass it on to our producer, or the other host, and we can blame him. Haven't been doing that enough recently, but thank you very much for your support, Porpoise. Another question I had was, okay, so there have been, as Dr. X said at the very beginning of this, there are sometimes conspiracies, and one of the more terrifying ones that I can think of course, was the Tuskegee experiments, and so people sit there and say, well, why should we trust doctors and medicine? And what do you say to something like that?
Well, yeah, the history of medical malpractice, especially in the 20th century, is actually fairly horrific. So if you're a member of a marginalized community where you can point towards in America with African Americans, the Tuskegee experiments, back home in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we had this thing called the unfortunate experiment, where doctors were tracking the development of lesions in the cervix to see whether they became cervical cancer. So they would detect lesions in the cervix. They would not tell the woman that they had those lesions because they wanted to see whether they would develop into cancer long term. And like the Tuskegee experiments, it wasn't as secret as people think it was. People were publishing on this in medical journals. It simply wasn't being talked about in the public. And of course, what happens is that 10 or 20 years later, as people start to die and there are investigations and people want to see their notes, they discover that doctors have been doing this medical experimentation on populations. And that's the reason why we have ethics committees now. The thing is, the Tuskegee experiments in the US, the unfortunate experiment in Aotearoa, New Zealand, are the motivating factors as to why when you want to do clinical research of this kind, you need to get permission to do it. So we had a long history of medical malpractice, and there are people who are very much aware of that. And this is kind of the problem of the 20th century when it comes to conspiracy theories. The 20th century was a very good time for discovering that authorities were nowhere near as trustworthy as they had made themselves out to be. And we faced a massive loss of trust in institutional and epistemic authority because of it. And now people are going, oh, it's so surprising. There are all these conspiracy theories out there. And the answer is, well, yes, there are those conspiracy theories out there in part because people were aware that you were conspiring in the past, and they're concerned you haven't changed your behavior. And that's why these COVID-19 conspiracy theories are so pernicious. People are pointing towards past medical misadventure and going, well, look, they've done these experiments in the past. Why not think they're doing them now? And that's a really hard thing to combat.
Yeah, I mean, even on top of that, I think if we're going to bring up Tuskegee, like, I wouldn't even call that a conspiracy because we know they did it. Like, we know that very much happened. Like, that was a thing. And it alludes to the United States, at the very least, our unfortunately very rich and vast history of medical racism and eugenics. I mean, just straight up, that's part of what Tuskegee was, what Henrietta Lacks, what that situation was about. A lot of forced sterilization of women of color. I mean, if we as the United States can't really like grapple with our history and our past and how our eugenics programs and philosophy inspired that of Nazi Germany, then we are really going to, I think, have a difficult time actually combating conspiracy theory when we take a look at that 20th century history that is really, I think, as Dr. X correctly said, taken away a lot of trust in these institutions because of the very real things that happened. I think a lot of people also just kind of like take the wrong message from all of that history. I think the focus should be more on, okay, these things did happen. We should take that energy and apply it towards prevention of these things, informed consent being one of the mechanisms by which we go ahead and prevent things in a medical context. But I would rather that energy be directed at correcting systemic flaws rather than simply saying, well, what if mysterious powers that be are taking advantage of the same situation to do that to me in the future? What if they're doing it right now? Like, we could go through the entire, philosophical exercise of, okay, how do you know? And going through it in a very Socratic way, examining what evidence and they may or may not have for their claims. But, those discussions ultimately seem pretty pointless and non-productive simply because, a lot of the folks who believe these things might simply just dig in, double down, and not necessarily change their mind or drift away from these conspiracy theories. What I want to do is to try and improve material conditions in such a way that people are not incentivized to go down that rabbit hole in the first place, but rather they can look at what the institution is saying at face value and say, okay, that seems fair. I trust this. I'm going to believe them and change what I'm doing, modify my behavior based on what the scientists and the doctors are saying. rather than, Alex Jones at InfoWars or insert your favorite conspiracy theorist here. I think really it's just there's a void of trustworthy, good communication, and people turn to the outside fringe communicators to fill that void because they yearn for it. They yearn for people to care about them, to validate their concerns, to validate their worries, and to tell them what's going on.
So, Dr. X, you had said, and I want to expand on this a little bit, that in the case of some conspiracy theories, if you believe in the deep state and that the election was stolen from Trump, now that, by the way, that theory has actually had some significant consequences. But you did say that the medical or the scientific theories are a bit different because they can have consequences. They can keep you from seeing your doctor, getting even, your annual checkup if you think that your doctor's in on some conspiracy. Is there a particular ethical conundrum in scientific these kinds of conspiracy theories? Is it something that people who peddle are on extra shaky ground, or is it just more reinforcing of we need to examine these things?
I mean, it's a complicated question because, of course, when we start talking about conspiracy theories, we're talking about conspiracy theorists. And, of course, there are two types of conspiracy theorists. There are your David Ickes and your Alex Jones, your promoters of very particular conspiracy theories. And then you've got what you might take to be the 𝗲𝗚𝗆, this is the general conspiracy theorist in society. And most people, I would argue, are only moderately or weakly committed to their conspiracy theories. They're kind of entertaining them as ideas. Unfortunately, entertaining them as ideas does have consequences. If you even think there's something vaguely plausible to the idea the COVID-19 vaccine is a vector for calamity or death, then you're less likely to get vaccinated. You're probably also less likely to wear a mask in a public space. You're probably less likely to engage in social distancing. So even if you're not really truly committed to the conspiracy theory, that weak commitment still has consequences. The worry is when you get your Alex Joneses and your David Ickes, these people who seem to be really strongly committed to their conspiracy theories, there's also the attendant worry that they actually might not be sincere in their belief around these conspiracy theories. So, I mean, one of the constant complaints about Alex Jones is that he might be engaged in a bit of a grift, in that he seems to spend a lot of his time talking about the stock that needs to sell out on his web store and the fact you need to give InfoWars money, and that maybe the conspiracy theories are actually more a mechanism to keep a particular audience on board. And there's a huge ethical worry there around the grift mentality we find with particular conspiracy theorists. And that ethical concern is different from the one we have about people who might have weak to moderate belief in these things. Because the way we react to an Alex Jones or a David Icke with kind of strong condemnation is going to be different to the way we want to engage with other people who are still trying to work out whether the beliefs they have are plausible or not. So, yeah, it's a very difficult issue to unpack because I think there's a lot of very different degrees of belief here, and thus we have very different duties towards the people depending on how strong their commitment is to their conspiracy theory.
All right. So I want to see if Azandring has any other questions, and then I'm going to ask. I want to know what each of you, your sort of the conspiracy theory that you think is the most unhinged or troubles you the most. I've got my pet one. Azandring, did you have any other questions?
Just one. What would your solution, if you were given the ultimate power, what would your solution be to people like Alex Jones? What would you do about that?
Well,
I mean, I would fire
that's
Alex
a really
Jones
good question. That's a hard
into the sun using a railgun, but unfortunately the technology just isn't with us yet.
I was going to say that was a hard question, but I think you came up with the correct answer. I may have overestimated the difficulty of that one. Well, so I mean, I do like the answer. It's elegant. I think it's appropriate. It's certainly just. It's balanced. He certainly deserves it. But that notwithstanding, we don't have that power. So what do you do? What do you do with people like Alex Jones in a ostensibly country centered around free speech?
I mean, I would say give deplatforming a try. It turns out that actually deplatforming Alex Jones from Twitter had a huge effect on his bottom line. Deplatforming Alex Jones from YouTube had a huge effect on his bottom line. It turns out that due to the algorithmic way that the internet now works, a lot of his audience was inflated, not because people are interested in the topic, but the algorithms were taking people to institutions like InfoWars and PrisonPlanet.com. So deplatforming works, and it's not really any kind of contravention to a central ethos of free speech. No one deserves a platform, and no one should expect that once they have a platform, that platform is there forever. So I'd say, yeah, continue the effort to erode Alex Jones's audience base by simply going, well, look, you don't deserve these platforms. If we believe in a meritocracy, Alex Jones probably shouldn't be a prominent member of anyone's society.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go a couple of steps farther. I mean, fundamentally, I believe that meritocracy is
you would go further than the railgun.
Not farther than the railgun. I mean, if we had the railgun power, I would be operating the railgun. I would be happy to pull or push whatever lever or button necessary to fire the thing. Absolutely. But in reality, as it pertains to meritocracy, I think it's dead and buried. And I really think that sort of that like the death of credentialism almost that we're currently experiencing, and sort of this rise of independent media and independent quote unquote experts who now suddenly have all of their degrees in epidemiology and foreign affairs as it pertains to the pandemic and wars in Ukraine and whatnot. Really deplatforming, I agree that I think should be the first step across all platforms. It's unfortunate that to achieve that, we're fundamentally reliant on the benevolence of private entities such as Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, aka Google, and then the like. Again, I want to see that happen, but there seems to be a lot of inconsistency in terms of how deplatforming is applied, simply because a lot of these tactics will also be weaponized against people who occupy the political left, if history is to teach us any lessons. People who are overt leftists, as they describe in their worldview, are often subject to some of the same tactics as conspiracy theorists in terms of them being deplatformed off of places like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and the rates at which that happens, I think, are actually higher than the rates of deplatforming for people who are peddling mis and disinformation, which is the opposite of how the notion of deplatforming should be applied. It should be applied to people who are doing the most overt harm in public-facing spaces owned by private entities. But I still ultimately advocate for deplatforming. I think we just have to be cognizant of how that could be weaponized against people who are otherwise approaching any given issue in good faith with the notion of trying to improve material conditions for people. But even if, let's say, we deplatform an Alex Jones type from every social media, you're kind of seeing this phenomenon where they're kind of making their own. Obviously, Infowars.com still has its own website. You're starting to see other live streaming platforms and Twitter clones pop up. You got your Gab, your Truth Social, your things that. Yeah. So there's always going to be sort of these self-insulating spheres of social media where people who believe in conspiracy theories, and especially the grifters who invent them and distribute them for profiteering reasons, they're going to find spaces to sort of give their audience that welcome home where they can tune in and drop out, really, and figure out what the latest talking points are and start parroting them. So I think deplatforming is a good start, but we have to go farther in terms of how we respond as a society than just deplatforming. Obviously, we don't have the ability to do re-education camps in the most literal sense, where you are sitting people back down in a classroom and to be like, okay, let's go over how high school biology works again. Here's why the vaccine isn't turning your brain into Swiss cheese. sure, that would be ideal, but I think it speaks to a flaw in our education system where people aren't already inoculated mentally against this kind of thing in the first place. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, in my opinion. So if we can really almost teach people about this kind of thing, especially as it pertains to philosophy, how do we know things? How did we arrive at these conclusions? If we can teach people that much earlier in their education, they're going to be well equipped to encounter conspiracy theorism in the real world, online and social media, right? They're going to see these things and say, okay, that's a little suspicious because of X, Y, or Z, or oh, clearly this person's a grifter. They're just selling me vitamins in their web store. So, there's I think room to really address things from a systemic perspective while ultimately trying to do something right here, right now with deplatforming. I think it's sort of an all of the above type of thing. We should do whatever actually gives us the outcomes we're looking for.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, deplatforming is kind of the short-term salve. The long-term salve is actually having an education system which works. The problem is that is a very long-term solution. And you might be concerned with things like, say, anthropogenic climate change, that we don't have as much time to bring these solutions in as maybe we would have had, say, 30 or 40 years ago.
All right, and from
I don't disagree with that. It's difficult. Like just the time frame. If we're to listen to scientific consensus, where a lot of the things are kind of set in motion, and our best hopes are to blunt the impact rather than prevent climate change as it stands right now. What the question becomes, what do we do? And I think we're reaching the point where it's large scale political action that really seems to be the only potential saving grace that we have. We can cite the overwhelming scientific consensus on that issue, which is very, very rare with any issue in science. We're always fighting with each other. Academics love to talk shit and spike publications and stuff because someone's research might be detrimental to their own research within academia. Academics love tearing each other down in many capacities. So when it comes to the overwhelming consensus for an issue like that, we have to take that and really expand upon it to say science has really not agreed as much as it agrees right now. We need to get the citizenry to engage with that, understand that, and then act based upon that. And we're already sort of seeing some of that with like the Sunrise Movement as an example, or one of the points of emphasis for them as it pertains to electing politicians is, how far do you go on climate change? Do you support the Green New Deal? Do you support all of these scientifically backed measures to start addressing these kinds of things? So we just have to translate a lot of that into actual grassroots efforts and mobilization beyond just pointing to consensus.
All right. Is Andrew any other thoughts before we start to wrap this up?
I have lots of thoughts, but we don't have enough time.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll remind you, gentlemen. I did want to discuss two shows with you. So I'm hoping now that I've got a captive audience, what we can do as soon as the credits roll, we can chat about two shows that both Xandering inspired, believe it or not, that wanted to discuss with you. So stick around after the show. So one of the theories that what triggers me the most, and I think the reason is because it seems to me that it doesn't take a lot of thought to take this one down. Now, Dr. Reverend Christopher 𝗲𝗷𝗆 Esquire Jr. says, quote, humans will always desire the feeling of, quote, cracking the code. Conspiracy theories tap that. And I think that disincentivizes critically thinking about them. One of the ones for me is Pfizer has the cure to cancer, and they're not releasing it because that's how they make more money, is by treating it instead of curing it. And I understand I'm a big thinker, so I have to look at the big picture and then work my way small. And so I take a look at the big picture and I say, the reason Pfizer exists is because we've cured so many diseases that human beings are living longer and having more diseases. The more human beings there are on the planet, the more we're going to need pharmaceuticals. And the longer we age, the more opportunity there is for disease, and the more we end up with elective surgeries. We end up with all sorts of new and interesting ways to use science. So it seems to me curing cancer it wouldn't take very long before you started getting a lot more money from that. So that's just one of my theories where I was just like, I don't know. Every time I hear that it's like they're holding the cure for cancer, and that's why. So that's one that just really grinds my gears, as it were. So Homozygoat, which one do you think gets you the most?
I mean, I think it's less of a grinds my gears type of getting me, and more I'm very immediately concerned type of getting me. But it's QAnon and really anything that's functioning as an extension of that, simply because it's starting to actually galvanize overt fascist action. Just the other day we had a whole bunch of Nazis who popped out of a U-Haul with weapons ready to attack a pride parade, and they were arrested. I think one because a concerned citizen called the cops and saw them loading all their stuff into the U-Haul. And another one, I think, I don't know if they had like somebody on the inside or what, but a lot of the extension of.
Funny you should mention that. I was there for that.
But you were at the actual.
I was in Post Falls when that happened. I saw all the police activity. I was literally 100 yards away from that.
Yeah, I mean, you were there. Like, they were, I think there was probably 30 of them, if I remember correctly, 30 or 31. But, I mean, you saw them. They were about to engage in what is functionally a domestic terrorist attack because, a lot of what they're being led to believe as far as, all the LGBTQ people are groomers, because, QAnon told us that, the politicians are doing it, and now they're letting it run rampant in society so they can, groom more children into their giant, adrenochrome farming operation or whatever it is. Like, we're basically seeing a resurgence in things that people would otherwise view as just like, deranged, entirely separate from reality and overtly violent. But as it stands, we're seeing, great replacement theory. All queer people are grooming pedophiles. The whole like politician, child sex trafficking. Like, we're seeing all of this kind of blur into a theory of everything, and people are now, unfortunately, acting on it in overtly violent ways. So for me, like, that frightens me because it can happen really anywhere, anytime. You just get one person with easy access to weapons in this country, and now you're off to the races where you've engaged in stochastic terrorism by pushing a theory like this.
Dr. X, any theories that really trigger you in some way or another? Conspiracy theories?
Well, I mean, basically, I'm just going to echo the concern about the Great Replacement thesis and the idea that we have a resurgent scientific racism going on. So it's not just we've got the Great Replacement thesis and kind of the return of Nazis. So I had hoped we'd defeated finally back in the middle of the 20th century, but it turns out they're either living on the dark side of the moon or underneath Antarctica, and they've managed to come back and return back to society. But the fact that scientific racism continues to be an active research topic in some parts of the academy, which then legitimizes the idea that there is racial superiority or these significant differences that justify, say, living segregated lifestyles, or the idea that we shouldn't mix the races. The fact that there is institutional or even sometimes epistemic authority applied to theses like this to then legitimize them in debate. It's chilling because we know where this leads. We know what happened at the beginning of the 20th century with eugenics. We know what happened in the middle of the 20th century with the Shoah and all of the other eradication of different racial groups in Europe. And the worry is, it could happen again. I mean, it happened in the 20th century. We've got the precursors for it now. It's a very frightening time to be alive.
Yeah, I mean, I've been telling people we live in Weimar Republic, Germany, but America.
Yeah.
That's not a popular thesis, but if you watch what's going on with our politics on the left and right, I've got an interesting theory on that, but I'll save that for another time. Is Andrew any thoughts as to the conspiracy theory that sort of most triggers you or intrigues you?
Yeah, the scientific racism one, I think, both worries me and intrigues me because people are trying to take some things that have been observed and they're trying to draw conclusions from it to fit their own narratives. And I think that they're making a lot of errors when they draw their conclusions from observed facts. And it's very difficult to combat because a lot of the stuff that they're using is observed facts and or observations that have been made. So it's like how do you disprove that? But then they're like, okay, well, we're going to go the step farther. Not only are we observing this as a general trend over a vast population, we're now going to apply this to all individuals. And I have a huge problem with that because you can't take general observations about a large population and apply them to each individual and expect that you're going to be right all the time. So it violates individual liberty, individual rights. So I have a huge problem with that. So it's one of the things that both concerns me and it interests me in how people get where they get.
Yeah,
all right.
And just to
please
interject slightly on that note, me and Professor Q, as his Twitch name is, but Dr. Connor, who's a teaching associate professor at the University of Missouri. We actually wrote a salon piece on the resurgence of race science, so I can link that in the Teams chat if you're interested.
Please,
Sure.
I've read it, and one of the things that would like to do is to get, this is going to be another one, and I've already reached out to President Sunday, but we wanted to get you, President Sunday, and possibly one more to sort of cover a wide variety of disciplines to have that discussion in the future. So we'll hit you up about that, and like I said, stick around because there's a couple of things that we wanted to ask you guys about after the show. But thank you all for joining us. If you like the content, please like, subscribe, share. It helps us out. It's a great way to help us out. If you also feel like you want to participate, you can participate in the Discord. You can become a patron. So we've got any number of ways to support the show. Thank you, Homozygoat. Thank you, Dr. X, for coming. It's always delightful to have both of you on. 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐴𝐺, I was going to say thank you for coming. You were here, and I didn't even realize it. I don't know. We'll have to talk to the producer about that one too. The producer was just off his game tonight. So. All right, well, and then tomorrow, 9:45, we are going to start our coverage of day 3 of the hearings. We're looking at, Titan's been spreading that one around. That's a good article. 9:45, roughly 9:45 tomorrow, we are going to start the day 3 of the hearings. We're going to do what we did last time. We're going to try to have no more than really 10 minutes of commentary. Sometimes I think commentary does need to be added in the hearings, but for the most part, we're just going to play the hearings through and then a discussion as long until we feel like we've gone through the whole thing. So we're on the East Coast. Most of the people we get are on the West Coast, so it's a bit early for them, but we'll see who shows up. I hope you will be there. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good night.